So now I would like to introduce Dr. Scott Barolo. Dr. Scott Barolo, he is the director of PIPS here at the University of Michigan. PIPS is the program in Biomedical Sciences, which is the umbrella program that hosts about 14 departments and programs at the University of Michigan. He's also an associate professor of cell and developmental biology. And Dr. Scott Barolo, he's been a director of PIPS for 5 years now. He got his PhD from UC San Diego in developmental genetics. And right now, his research interests are, and I'm paraphrasing, I hope I'm doing a good job, a cell talk between neighboring cells through specific signaling by specific sequences called enhancers in the genomes of receiving cells and gene regulation. I also included Dr. Scott Barolo, his Twitter. He's very avid and very, he likes to use Twitter a lot. So also give him a follow. And further, with any more to say, I would like to let Dr. Scott Barolo share his presentation with us.
Okay, thanks so much. Yes, that was a wonderful introduction, Gissell. Very accurate. You nailed it. Thank you. I'm delighted to be invited by the wonderful SACNAS chapter here at U of M. This organization does amazing things, and I just want to encourage everybody here to get involved with SACNAS if you're not already. It's a terrific group. I've been asked to come and give you some pointers and tips about how to write a research statement and a personal statement for your PhD application. So let me show a slide to get us started. Okay. Can you see this, Gissell?
Yes, it looks perfect.
Okay, good. All right. I'm going to try to, in the limited time that we have, I'm going to try to hit some of what I think are the major points, including some questions that students have asked me leading up to this event. But if you have specific questions that I'm not covering, I think you should be able to type them into the chat, and I will look for those. And if I don't see them because I'm presenting, Gissell, maybe you could shout them out. Okay, great.
I will serve as a moderator.
Thank you.
I will interrupt you in between if you're okay, or will you like to address the question after?
You can just jump in anytime. It's fine.
Sounds great. Thank you.
I don't really have a formal presentation for you. I'm just going to try to give you my thoughts and try to answer your questions. So as Gissell mentioned, I'm the director of PIBS, the Program in Biomedical Sciences at U of M, which for those of you who don't know, it's an umbrella PhD program. That means that it actually includes multiple PhD programs. I'm telling you these details because it kind of matters when you apply to the PIBS program as opposed to applying directly to a department. It kind of affects the how you should approach that application and to some extent, maybe what you should write. So when you're getting ready to apply to a particular program like PIBS or any other, you should research it a little bit, look it up on the web, figure out what it's all about, what its focus is, and what the mission statement of that school or department or program is. For example, there are some schools that are really focused on training students to be academic researchers. There are other programs that want to train students in STEM to go into a variety of different career paths, okay? And, I mean, I think there's no right or wrong answer to that. You can be whichever kind of program that you want. But for you as an applicant, you should know going in that if a program that you're applying to is really focused on creating academic researchers, and your focus is that you want to get your PhD training and then take that into science communication, that may not be a great fit for for you as a training environment, and you might not want to emphasize that in your application if you do apply there. So do your homework and study up on the programs. This is a list of, I think, what most PhD programs look at, not in any particular order here. Certainly, letters of recommendation from your past research mentors are important, and your research and personal statements are important too. I'm not going to go down this whole list and talk about it. We could talk for hours about everything on this list, but I've been asked to focus on personal statement and research statement, so I'll skip ahead to that. After I mention that the PIBS umbrella program doesn't require GRE scores, and in fact, we don't, starting this year, we don't accept GRE scores. So that's one thing that you don't have to worry about with us. We're also a program, and again, this varies from program to program, so you have to ask. We're a program that doesn't have any specific cutoff. We don't have GPA cutoff. We don't have a GRE cutoff. No one given number or thing that's going to make us reject your application out of hand. We know that there are lots of ways to be a good scientist and lots of ways to be a good applicant for graduate school. But you need to find out whether this is, to what extent this is true of each program that you're applying to. So once again, do your research. Okay, so within the PIBS program, as I said, there are multiple PhD programs inside PIBS. And when you are accepted to PIBS, you can, after your first year is done and your research rotations are done, you can join any of these PhD programs. It's the way umbrella programs basically work. But in the admissions process, we ask you to choose a first choice and a second choice program. And you should know that those faculty from those programs are the most likely to see your application, right? So if you select genetics as your number one choice PhD program, it doesn't mean that you have to join genetics, but it means that we're going to send your application to the genetics program to look at first. And most of the people who read your application, and probably many of the people that interview you, if you get invited to interview, are going to be from genetics. And you should write your statements accordingly, okay? So that's some inside information. And, different things apply to different schools. Again, there's a contact number, email or phone number, and you can call that number for each program to get this kind of information for any program that you're interested in. So know the program, and then I'm going to spend the rest of the time just talking about research and personal statements. Know the program and read the instructions on the application for the research statement and the personal statement. So this is your research statement, your academic statement of purpose. These are the instructions you'll get in the PIBS application. You can see it's pretty brief, pretty open-ended. It's meant to be kind of a loose guide to what we're looking for. And for those who are applying to STEM research programs, research is going to be featured very heavily in your statement here. There's lots of things you can talk about, but for the most part, this statement ought to be about your research, the research that you've done, and how that has led you to applying to this particular program. Okay, so we'll talk about the academic statement of purpose first, and then we'll move on to the personal statement. This is usually somebody who's drawing on the screen. Yeah, there it is. My research, exactly. Let me drop in actually a little text of my own, if this works. Oh, there it is. Okay. So what I've dropped in here is some text. It's actually taken from the PIBS website. I didn't write this, but this is the guidance that we provide on our website for writing the research statement. And again, we're focused on research here. I'm going to answer specific questions about this in a minute, but basically I agree with what is written here. What we would like you to do is, if you have multiple research experiences, you should mention all of them and kind of tell us your journey from one to the other. But you don't have to give equal weight to all of those. And in fact, If there's one research experience that you've had that is the primary one in your mind, the one that was the most impactful or where you spent the most time or learned the most, I would focus on that one. And you could even say, straight up in your research statement, I've done research in 2 labs or 3 labs or whatever it is, but I'd like to focus on, because this is the most meaningful research experience to me, this is the one that I'll spend most of my time focusing on. And that's perfectly okay. Is there a question?
Yes, there is a question.
Okay.
So Lindsay is asking, for the research statement, should we focus more on the technical aspect of the research or how it has influenced our careers, goals?
Yeah, I think this is really a blend of those two things. But within your academic statement of purpose, I guess I would say probably most of the words are going to be used to describe your research project. And when I say describe your research project, it's really important to know what that means for our purposes. We don't need a detailed protocol of the experiments that you did. We don't need an unabridged list of everything that you did. We don't need to know how much magnesium chloride was in a particular PCR reaction, unless that is the key to what you learned from that project, right? So the minute procedural details of individual things that you did are not that important, and you don't need to be comprehensive. What we're interested in is a couple of key things. Why were you doing these experiments? In other words, what was the question behind them? What was the motivation to do them? It's very important to most faculty reading these things that the student has some concept of the question and the urgency behind this particular experiment. Why did we want to know the answer to this question? What was the question behind this? And sometimes we will see research statements that describe experiments, but there's no indication that the student has any understanding of why they were doing it. Now, we don't expect a PhD level understanding or a faculty level understanding of why you were doing it and all the details. We expect an undergraduate or a technician or a postbac or a master's level, wherever you were, right? So don't get too intimidated by that. But we want to know that you have put some thought into the research that you've done. You've thought about why you're doing this experiment and what the results could mean. And so that's one big thing. Why were you doing it? What's the question behind it? And the other big, I guess that's 2 really, right? And then so I guess I should say the third one, after why were you doing it? What was the question behind it? The third one is, what did you learn? And sometimes what you learned is how to persevere through an experiment that didn't work, right? Sometimes what you learned is a tiny detail about a molecule that nobody's ever heard of, right? Very rarely do we see a research, we've never seen a research statement where somebody says, and that's how we cured the disease. That is not the standard to hold yourself to, okay? What did you learn, right? Focus on that. Because that tells us you're capable of learning from experiments, which is the key thing, right? Knowledge is actually not that important going into graduate school. What's important is the ability to learn, because you're going to be generating new knowledge, right? It's not about memorizing a book. So if you're capable of learning from your experiments at any stage of research along the way, even if it's just one tiny thing, even if it's something about yourself, right, and how you work, or what interests you, or that sort of thing. But tell us what you learned.
There's 2 questions in the chat.
Yeah.
2 more questions in the chat.
Go for it.
Julia is asking, how will you recommend approaching a research statement when you have been in the same lab for multiple years and worked on both long-term and short-term projects? Right.
I think I like that here. Here's a question. What if I've only done research in one lab? That's totally fine. The expectation that you've worked in more than one lab. And this gets to the question of how much research experience is needed to successfully apply to a PhD program. And the truth is, this is one area where there is kind of a cutoff, although it's not a hard number. But we do, when we're reading PhD applications, we do expect a certain amount of substantial research experience. Now, let me explain that fully before you quit applying to graduate school, because that's it. It's a nuanced thing. What we want to see is that you have done enough research that you really understand what it is and you know you like it. Because it's one thing to like your science classes. It's one thing to like, for example, before I went to joined the lab, I really liked nature specials. I liked reading science, but getting in the lab and doing science is a different thing. It's not that whether or not you can hack it. It's just that some people just don't like the actual hands-on experience of doing research, and some do. And there's no way to tell from classes. You have to actually get in the lab and do it. And you don't want to find that out in your third year of your PhD project, right? That's the key. You want to find that out before you apply to graduate school, so that if graduate school is not a waste of time for you. So that's one thing we're looking for, is that you've done enough to get an idea of what research is like and what you like about it and why you want to continue. Now, how much experience is that? I can't put a number on it. I will say that we do look at that number, however much research experience you have, whether it's full-time or part-time. We put it in the context of what research experiences were available to you, right? So a student who went to a university that doesn't have a huge number of lab research opportunities for undergrads, for example, we're going to hold that student to a different standard in terms of how much research experience they have compared to somebody who went, say, to the University of Michigan, where there's 40,000 labs, right? If you were working during college, right? If you are dealing with disability or illness, if you are taking care of family members, right? All of these things impact your ability. And we know that these opportunities are not equitable, right? So, for example, some students can afford to volunteer in a lab for free, others can't, right? So we know that opportunities are not equally distributed. So we put your research experience in a context. However, there is a basic cutoff that you have to have done enough. And I would say probably one semester of part-time undergrad research is probably not enough. Although, prove me wrong, right? I mean, this is what your statements are for. If you can show that in that time you've learned enough to know that you want to continue, then apply and write and put that in your statement. Again, this is a big key thing to, for what these statements are for, is to put the rest of your application in the proper context so we can understand it. So if you've only done research in one lab, that's fine. If you have, if you graduated from college 10 years ago, that's not a problem, right? Apply. If your only research is out of academia and it's as a technician in industry, that's fine. Tell us about that, right? We're just interested in your research experiences. Don't count yourself out on that score. Just tell us about it. And if I can go back, I think I already talked about this. Yeah, I basically already talked about this. You don't need to get too much into the minute details. We need to know that you understand, you remember. And I would say it's a basic guideline. If you can't remember enough of your project to be able to talk about it, you can't get your head back into it, then it might be good to refresh yourself with more research experience, right? If it was that short of an experience, or if it was that long ago, it might be that you're not going to be able to get the strongest letter of recommendation, for example. Again, your situation may differ. I'm not telling you to count yourself out, but if you can't write a convincing statement about why this research project was of interest and what you learned from it, then that might be a problem in your application. Go ahead, Gissell.
Yeah, sorry. Before you continue with more piece of information, Elisa and Tigran are asking a little bit more about the current situation in which we are, which is the pandemic.
Yes.
Elisa is asking, what if COVID affected the opportunities we had for research?
Absolutely. Thank you for mentioning that. I was planning to talk about it, and I appreciate the reminder. We know, we are all aware, and every admissions faculty at every university is aware, that undergraduate research, well, really, and almost all research opportunities were limited this year. And that's unfair to those of you who, for example, are seniors this year, just to pick one group that's unfair to. We're aware of that, and we are doing our best to try to take that into account. If you're a post-bac scholar, you're in the same boat, right? It's just difficult to get in the lab this year. If you never got a chance to get into the lab, then I'm afraid that you may need to wait another cycle and try to get some more lab experience. That's just a hard reality. If your lab experience is less than you thought it was going to be, it's a judgment call. If you think you've got enough that you can talk about and write about your project compellingly, then I say go for it. But
Yeah,
but again, I would mention in your research statement and in your perhaps in your personal statement, if you decide where to put it. But at some point, at some relevant point, you should mention that COVID has impacted your ability to get into the lab, because that is relevant.
yeah, a few more people in the chat kind of like were asked about that. Tigran asked, will you recommend a gap year to build up your technician or research experience before applying? Fatima is also asking, the question she asked, how would it be to apply this year? And then she comes to us and tells us that she has research experience. I'm trying to read, but she's also done leadership and volunteering experience. How good is that also to your application?
Yeah, I think, I mean, it's kind of an individual decision. I mean, most of the programs that I know about are taking PhD students this year. I haven't heard a lot about major cutbacks in terms of the number of PhD students to be taken. There might be cutbacks. I know that, you know, universities are tightening their belts, and that might affect the number of slots that are available. You know, the other side of that is that COVID is probably going to impact the availability of additional research jobs if you want to get that extra lab experience. So it's tough on both ends. If you have a good opportunity, if you feel like this lack of research experience is probably a weakness, and you have an opportunity to take another year and get more, that might be the best choice. I really can't give a blanket piece of advice to that. Sometimes you're not quite ready and you just have to jump in and go for it anyway. Talking with your research advisors and mentors and peers and people in the labs that you've worked with might be a good way to help you make this decision, but it is a tough one.
Thank you, Scott.
I will say one tiny last detail about that. There's no penalty for those who work in a lab for any number of years after graduating from college, a post-bac program. That doesn't look bad on your application. In fact, we love to see that you love research enough that you've spent multiple years doing it for a living. So it definitely won't hurt you that if you're not fresh out of college. Okay, so, and I already mentioned this too. You know, I've talked a lot about the questions and what you learned from the project. We don't expect you to have a PhD thesis level understanding. We know where you're at. We've seen your CV, and that's what we're looking for. We want somebody who's kind of dedicated and interested, not all knowing. So you don't have to pretend to understand everything about the cell cycle or whatever it is that you're studying. You upfront about what you do understand and what you don't understand, because that's where we all are. There are things about my field that I understand and things that I don't understand. That doesn't look bad. We want to know that you've been paying attention and you've had your head in the game and you've been really thinking about the research that you've done. Okay, I'm going to move on to, I can continue to take statements or questions about the research statement and academic statement of purpose, but I'm going to move on to the personal statement just because I want to show you what it looks like in the PIBS application. This is the question. You can see it's kind of a longer question, but it's a little vaguer too. It's basically just tell us about you and your story and what led you to apply to a PhD program at the University of Michigan. And so I'm also going to drop in some of the guidance that we supply on the website. So it's about your life. It's about your background, your life experiences, the things that you have done, the challenges that you've faced, the opportunities that you've had. You know, I don't think you should feel compelled to re-traumatize yourself with sad stories of things that have happened to you, but I think you should talk about things in your life that are relevant to this decision. And this is, again, an opportunity to talk about, for example, if you were ill, if you were taking care of a parent or a child during college and your GPA suffered, this might be a time to talk about that, right? If you were working, et cetera, right? We pay careful attention to those things. This is also a great place to talk about, this is relevant to one of the questions that was asked in the chat. If you've been involved in student organizations that have impacted your view of science and research, if you've been a leader in other areas, that might be something that's really good to briefly mention here. We look for that, and we that means something to us if you've been a leader in the past, because I will say in our program in PIBS, we are you know, we're looking for all kinds of graduate students, but I have to say we try our best to nurture students here who want to be leaders, who want to create things and build people like Gissell, and we pay attention to that in the personal statement and in the CV. So this is a great place to highlight things like that. There are also special fellowships for people who have done things like that. So another good reason to mention it. How will you contribute to the diversity of the Michigan student body? There are lots of, answer that question, that, you know, that part of the question basically any way you see fit, but what we really are looking for a diverse body of students in every way imaginable, right? We want we want a gender balance, and we want a racially diverse. We want to bring in students who are historically excluded, and to support them in their PhDs. So if any of that describes you, students with disabilities, students who have lacked opportunities in other ways, this is a good place to mention that. It feels weird for many of us talking about yourself, and it's just a skill that you are going to have to build if you want to get into academia. So I built in this slide to remind me to remind you. It's important to brag about yourself, not to be obnoxiously arrogant, but to say what you've done. If your accomplishments are your accomplishments, and if you don't tell us about them, nobody will. So I really encourage you to brag on yourself, advocate for yourself. That actually means something in these statements. You know, for those of us who are first-gen scientists, first-gen academics, a lot of us, nobody told us how to do this. It's not necessarily part of the culture, but it is a skill that you can learn, and the best way to learn it is to practice it. One way I like to think about it is, imagine what your best friend would write about you, and then within reason, you know, write it that way about yourself. In other words, be as kind and generous to yourself as you would be to your best friend when writing these statements. Because again, you know, if you tell us in your statements that you're no good and you're not worthy of graduate school or whatever, people are likely to believe you. But if you present yourself as somebody who is ready for graduate school and knows that they want to go to graduate school and knows what they want from it, that means a lot. You don't have to know exactly what kind of I should say this applies to PIBS, not necessarily to every program. You don't need to know exactly what kind of research you want to do, or even exactly what field you want to be in. Probably the reason you're applying to an umbrella program is that you are keeping your options open at this point. So for PIBS, that is perfectly okay. If you are applying to a dedicated biochemistry program or a physics program, then you probably shouldn't say, well, I don't know if I want to do math or linguistics or physics, right? Because those more dedicated programs are looking for students who are pretty focused in on that field of research and know they like it, right?
Yeah, Scott, can I
Yeah.
ask you two questions that are actually related to what you just said? Jael Rodriguez is first asking, is one of the reason if one of the reasons I want to join a graduate school is a particular research group, should I make this information apparent in the statement?
Yes. Yeah. That's a great idea. It's likely that application will make their way to that person if they're in that program. You may get an opportunity to interview with that person, and I'll tell you a secret inside the professor's mind. I'm a professor, and when people think what I do is interesting, I think they're smart. That's just the way it works. If you think enhancers are cool, now I'm the director of the whole PIBS program. So in that capacity, I'm not only interested in students who want to work on enhancers, but if you're interested in my lab and you think that enhancers are the greatest thing ever, I think, boy, that person's really, really sharp. They get it. So yes, express your interests. I would also, however, give the impression, I think it's probably wise to give the impression that you're interested in potentially multiple labs, because if for whatever reason, if that particular lab isn't taking students that year, or they're thinking about moving, right, then they might think that you're not a good fit for that program because they don't want to disappoint you, right? So definitely express interest in labs, even multiple labs, that's totally fine. There's no point in listing 100 names, right? But if there are a few names that are of particular interest, yeah, definitely mention that. But also leave yourself a little bit of wiggle room.
Yeah, Ifra is also asking a similar question. He's asking, let's suppose I have a research experience in field A. However, I would like to pursue research in field B. How to draft a research proposal on field B with that research level understanding on it?
Yeah, I think that can work very well. I've seen it done. We've definitely taken a number of students into the PIBS program whose research was outside of our pretty broad area of expertise. I think you just need to put some effort into explaining why you know that you're interested in this in field B, right? That's where the skepticism might be. Do you really know enough about it to know that you really like it? So that's where you're going to have to sell us, right? What have you read? Who have you talked to? What was it? What were the factors that made you decide that this is your field of interest now? But if you've done research in another field, then and you can convince us that you understood it and that you liked it, then we know that you're going to be fine in graduate school. Are there any other questions coming up in the chat?
Yeah, are you done with your presentation?
Well, the only last thing I wanted to say was get started on this early, as early as you can. For the PIBS program, our deadline is December 1st. So that's like 8 weeks, right? 7, 8 weeks. Get started on that soon. I know these are intimidating documents to start, but at least I tell people all the time to write a garbage draft. I mean, write a draft that you know this is going to be shit, and you know it's going to be shit from the beginning, and the whole plan is just to have a shit draft, right? And that for me lowers the pressure. I can just put some garbage words on a piece of paper, and then I can make it good later when I revise it, and that gets me over that first hurdle of that blank piece of paper. So write it, get it to the point where you think it's pretty good, and show it to people. If you have a current research mentor, who is worth anything as a mentor, they'll be happy to read your research statement for you. If your current research mentor is not a good mentor, then you'll have to find other people to talk to about it. So give it to your colleagues in the lab, your ex-colleagues or your current colleagues. Give it to other STEM students that you know, and get their feedback on it. That's going to make a big difference. And then listen to that feedback and take it into account and make changes. That means you've got to have a decent draft done in enough time to get it to people and for them to get it back to you. So that means you've got to get cracking on that pretty soon. And that was my last piece of advice, but you said that we have some more stuff in the chat. So go ahead.
We had one more question in the chat. It comes from Rachel, and I believe she's asking for the type of undergraduate lab experiences that you get. She's asking, will it be helpful to include my undergraduate biology lab experience that were part of my major's curriculum? She included that on her CV. Would it be worth it to also talk about it in your research statement?
So we're talking about lab classes in biology in the field that you're going to be applying to. I mean, I would say if there's should you include it in your CV? Okay. I think if it doesn't hurt to include a line for that. If it's not clear from your transcript, it definitely doesn't hurt. I think people are not going to attach a lot of weight to the lab experience that you get in a lab class, just because it's to some extent you're protected from kind of failure in and creativity to some extent, and usually in those classes it's a defined protocol with a predictable outcome usually. But if there's something notable from that experience that impacted you, then you should mention it in your statements, and you should definitely list it on the CV. I see there's a question about direct admit options. And again, my answers are going to be PIBS specific, and this will vary from program to program. But within the PIBS umbrella, right now there are 13 PhD programs you can apply to. Several of those have direct admit options. You can find that information on the PIBS website and on the websites of the individual programs. So neuroscience is one of those. Just to pick one example that has probably a fairly large proportion of direct admits. So if you're interested in neuroscience research and you want to come to the University of Michigan, you can apply directly to the neuroscience program, which is a big program in and of itself. But I would say do that if you're sure that neuroscience is your thing. If you really like neuroscience, but you want to keep other options open, you might want to apply to PIBS and then choose neuroscience as your first choice program within the umbrella.
There was a question from Catherine. She's asking, for the personal statement, if our leadership or past experience with clubs and organizations is from several years ago, is this still valuable to include in the statement?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, mention anything that was significant to you, no matter when it was.
Fatima's asking, does unpublished research work count in the application, such as papers or projects that are in the process and not completed?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's one we get a lot about. What are the expectations for things that are published, and how much should you talk about things that are published versus unpublished? We don't have any minimum cutoff. We don't expect undergraduates, for example, to have published a research paper. And the reason for that is, although it's great if you do, that's fantastic. But to be honest, in many cases, whether or not an undergrad researcher has published a paper or not is largely due to factors outside of their control. What was the project that they were on? Was it ready to be published at that time? There are some labs that don't put undergrads on research papers, unfortunately, or the standards are a little bit higher, or they put them on projects that are kind of permanent projects that never really end. So we don't have a any kind of minimum standard. We don't expect you to have published a paper, but that wasn't really your question. Your question was, does unpublished research count? And yes, yeah, we're asking for the research you have done, and whatever the outcome of that was, whether it got published or not, we want to know about your experience with the research. That's the most important thing. I see, how long should an ideal CV be? Check the individual application for instructions about that. I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong with a 2-page CV. I don't think that's too long. We're pretty good at spotting obvious padding, so don't overreach yourself in terms of adding things, but anything that is, you know, legitimate, meaningful, and significant to you, I would definitely add. So that's why, for example, experiments that you did in a lab class as an undergraduate are not really, usually they're not a significant part of your research experience. So we don't really care about them that much, unless that's what triggered you to want to go into research, right? Yes, Tasman is dropping more info in the chat. Neuroscience, MCDB, bioinformatics. You can apply to the biophysics program directly. Are there others for PhD? I can't think of them right now, but there may not be others that you can apply directly, but that information is on our website. Here's another question from one from Catherine. Would you recommend applying direct admit if we're confident about 1 or 2 specific programs in PIBS, in addition to applying to PIBS more generally? It won't hurt you if you apply to MCDB directly and to PIBS as an MCDB primary choice. That will definitely not count against you. And in a sense, it does increase your chances. So if you're interested enough to do that, then I suppose it can't hurt you to do that. I would say there's no point in applying to PIBS if you are sure that one particular PhD program is the one that you want. If you know that MCDB is what you want at the University of Michigan, then don't apply to PIBS. Apply directly to MCDB. Focus your energy on that.
We just have a question. Yeah.
Sorry?
Yeah, we just got another question. Also, you guys are welcome to unmute yourselves and ask directly. We still have 5 minutes until we're done with our session, and you're welcome to just unmute yourself.
Sure. Some of these things, as I said over and over again, they differ from program to program, and you really can use that contact info on their website to send them an email or call, and they will get back to you. That's part of their recruiting mission. They will get back to you with an answer to your question. Generally speaking, they're going to give you a straight answer because they want you to apply to the program that is a good fit for you. So
Rachel,
don't be afraid. Don't worry about bothering people at that email address. Just go ahead and fire off your questions.
Rachel Benedict has raised her hand.
Rachel?
So about the leadership experiences, if I don't have a lot of leadership experience, like outside of like being a technician, because like I've kind of been managing a lab, so I might include that as a leadership experience, but I don't really I haven't been a part of clubs or anything. Is it still possible for my application to be a strong one if everything else is good?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, like I said, there's not one recipe for a strong application. I mean, it would be easy for all of us if I could just tell you, this is the one way to do it. This is the one way to get into PIBS. But the truth is, and it's good news, there are many, many ways to have a successful application. And in fact, we want a class of students who have come to us through different routes and have different strengths and different interests. So that is part of the kind of diversity that we're looking for. So yes, I would say though that don't undersell your lab management as a leadership skill. That is leadership, that is organization, that is communication, right? You've been entrusted with a responsibility, and that's all something to talk about in your application for sure.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, that part has always intimidated me, like the personal statement part, because I'm always like, I feel like I don't know how to make myself unique and like stand out. But yeah, that's helpful to hear then. Thank you.
It is tough. And, you know, some of us just feel like we don't have a very interesting personal story. I've always felt that way. And, you know, and, you know, I think the key to that, the personal part of it is not to necessarily have the most amazing story that could be turned into a movie, but to just let us get to know you a little bit. Because you know, what happens is there's a bunch of faculty in a room. It's going to be a Zoom room this year, with stacks of applications, talking about them one at a time. And what you want is somebody in that room who is going to advocate for you and speak up for you, having read your application. And the way to get them to do that, I think the best way to get them to do that is not to have any particular number on your application, but to have to let that person get to know you a little bit. They'll remember you a little bit better, and they'll be able to fight for you more in that admissions meeting.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. There's a question about reaching out to professors. That depends on the program. If you're applying to a program where you are directly accepted into a lab, directly admitted into a laboratory, which is the norm in some fields, and it's kind of, you know, some life sciences programs do that and some don't. If that's the kind of program you're applying to, then you basically need to get one faculty member really interested in you as an applicant. For PIBs, it's not so important to reach out to individual faculty because we have admissions committees who are going to be looking at your application, and you're going to spend a year in our program before you, or 10 months before you even join a lab. You'll be doing research rotations. So again, that part just depends. If you're an undergrad, anything extra to take into account if you're an undergrad applying straight to a PhD program? No, I think you're probably hit by COVID harder than other applicants. And so you have to, you know, mention that and how that impacted you in your statement. But other than that, you're not at an advantage or a disadvantage coming straight out of college.
Well, we have.
Am I audible?
Go ahead, Fatima.
Yeah, I want to ask, sir, how much time does, on an average, a student should spend on writing a great or close to perfect statement of purpose?
Oh, it's really hard for me to give you a number because people write and behave so differently. But I guess I would say if you're waiting until a couple of days before the due date, that's not ideal. Because again, you want to give yourself enough time to have a decent draft, one that you don't find too embarrassing, that you can show to your mentors and your friends and your colleagues and get feedback on. So the more important thing is to start, as scary as it is, and nobody likes writing these things, but you're just going to have to hold your nose and jump into the pool and start putting some garbage down on paper. And I would suggest doing that this week if you can.
We will take one last question because I just noticed that Rachel raised her hand. That will be our last question, and then after that, I'll end the session.
So, do they pay attention to when you turn in your application? Like, let's say I turned in my application like 2 days before it's due. Do they pay attention to that?
In the PIPS program, no. We do not look at the application. We don't have any kind of rolling applications, and we do not look at any applications until after the deadline. And the people reviewing them have no idea when they were turned in.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, everybody. It's very grateful for the time that you took with us to give us such a helpful information. I hope everybody find it informative. Thank you so much, Scott, for giving us your time.
Thanks, Gissell. Go SACNAS.